Megan Cole and Ryan Fletcher looked like the perfect couple, until one of them ended up dead and the other laughed through the interrogation. Megan Cole and Ryan Fletcher were the kind of couple that made people believe in fairy tales. Their lives seemed picture-perfect, flawless, Instagram selfies, vacations in Bali, dinner dates at rooftop restaurants, and playful videos from their apartment. To the outside world, they were living a modern love story. Megan, with her sharp sense of style and confident smile, worked as a marketing manager at a growing tech firm. Ryan, artistic and slightly reserved, earned his living as a freelance photographer. They complemented each other in all the ways people thought mattered. She was outgoing and ambitious, he was calm and supportive. Friends described them as goals and envied how effortlessly they seemed to fit together. But not everything beautiful is stable. Behind the polished photos and glowing captions was a relationship quietly unraveling. It hadn't started that way. When they met at a photography exhibit 2 years earlier, it had been instant chemistry. Megan admired Ryan's passion, his creativity, and his patience. Ryan was drawn to Megan's drive, her energy, and her charm. They moved in together within 6 months, fully believing that they were building a life that would last. For a while, it worked. Their apartment was filled with laughter, late-night talks, and artistic collaborations. Ryan even used Megan as a model in some of his work, and she helped him market his business online. But something in Megan began to shift. Her love, once intense and affectionate, became possessive and demanding. She started keeping track of Ryan's whereabouts, checking his phone when she thought he was asleep, questioning the women who commented on his photos. At first, Ryan dismissed it as insecurity. He told himself it was just a phase. But it wasn't. Megan's behavior grew more erratic. If Ryan went out without her, there would be tears or cold silence when he returned. If he failed to reply to the message quickly, she accused him of cheating. The tension in the apartment thickened. What once felt like a home began to feel like a trap. Ryan, unwilling to confront it head-on, began to pull away. He spent more time out, took on more photo shoots, and avoided arguments by staying silent. He stopped including Megan in his creative projects, and kept his personal life more guarded. Megan noticed. She could feel him slipping away, and the more distant he became, the more desperate she grew to keep him. To her, losing Ryan wasn't just emotional, it was a personal failure, a threat to the image she had carefully built. Still, from the outside, everything looked fine. No one could have guessed what was simmering beneath the surface. Megan smiled at dinner parties, posted couple selfies weekly, and bragged about how lucky she was to have Ryan. But her mind was racing constantly, trying to solve a problem she believed was hers to control. She wanted Ryan close, obedient, and dependent, and if she couldn't have him that way, she would find a way to never lose him at all. The call came in at 7:12 a.m. on a rainy Thursday morning. Megan's voice was frantic, gasping between sobs, as she told the 911 operator that she had just found her boyfriend, Ryan, unresponsive on the kitchen floor. She said there was blood, so much blood, and that he wasn't breathing. Dispatch immediately sent paramedics and patrol officers to the couple's downtown apartment, a sleek third-floor unit in a quiet, upscale building. Rain tapped steadily against the windows as first responders rushed up the stairwell, unaware they were walking into a scene that would soon make headlines. The door was ajar when they arrived. Inside, the apartment was unusually quiet. Megan sat on the floor near the kitchen, rocking back and forth, her face pale, her hands smeared with blood. She pointed to the body. Ryan Fletcher lay face down in a pool of blood, a large kitchen knife beside his outstretched hand. There were no signs of life. A paramedic checked for a pulse while the other began assessing the scene. It was too late. Ryan had been dead for at least an hour. Megan cried harder when they told her he was gone. She kept repeating that she had tried to wake him, that she thought he had fallen, that she hadn't heard anything during the night. She insisted she had gone to bed early after a fight, left him in the kitchen, and found him like this in the morning. The officers took notes carefully. Everything about the scene was chaotic. But something didn't sit right. Megan was crying, yes, but it felt rehearsed. The lead officer noticed her hands, shaking slightly, but not from cold or trauma. There was no urgency in her movements. Her eyes darted to the clock more than once, as if waiting for something. One of the officers tried to comfort her, but Megan's focus shifted strangely. She started asking questions. "Do you think it was suicide? Could someone have broken in? He's been depressed, you know." Her tone was soft, but the words felt pointed, calculated even. The medical examiner arrived shortly after and confirmed the death was caused by multiple stab wounds. At least 3 of them were deep, and 1 had punctured the lung. The cuts on Ryan's arms looked like defensive wounds. That detail wasn't shared with Megan. Not yet. The police began photographing the scene. One noted that there was no blood trail leading to the body. No signs of a struggle in the living room or bedroom. Everything was oddly clean, too clean. As Megan was escorted to the station for a formal statement, the officers couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. The scene felt like it had been staged. Megan's clothes were soaked in blood, but her hair and face were perfectly clean. Her story kept changing slightly. First she found him when she woke up. Then she said she had heard a noise during the night. She said she called his name. She said she screamed. But the neighbors said they didn't hear a thing. No one did. At the station, Megan was calm, too calm. She sat in the small interview room with a blanket wrapped around her shoulders, sipping bottled water as if she were just waiting for a delayed appointment. The room was quiet, except for the faint hum of a ceiling light and the occasional scribble of a detective's pen behind the glass. Megan didn't ask for a lawyer. She didn't seem afraid. In fact, she offered to tell her story before anyone asked. She began by describing the evening before Ryan's death in detail. According to her, they had a small argument over something stupid. She couldn't even remember what it was, she claimed. She said Ryan drank a little, sat in the kitchen for a while, then told her he wanted to be alone. She went to bed and fell asleep. When she woke up in the morning, she said she found him lying on the floor in a pool of blood. Her voice cracked as she spoke, and she dabbed at imaginary tears with the sleeve of her sweatshirt. She mentioned his recent mood swings, how he had seemed withdrawn, and casually hinted that maybe he had done this to himself. But the detectives noticed something that didn't align with her words, her body language. She maintained eye contact too long, as if trying to convince rather than recall. She laughed softly when describing things that should have been horrifying, even saying at one point, it didn't look real, like something from a movie. Her hands, though still stained faintly red, never fidgeted. She didn't tremble. She didn't ask about funeral arrangements or whether she could see Ryan's body. Instead, she asked how long the process would take and whether she could get her phone back. The detectives remained patient. They knew this part of the process was critical. Let her talk. Let her slip. They asked her if she had ever felt unsafe around Ryan. She shook her head. Then they asked if Ryan had ever spoken of harming himself. She paused too long, then said, maybe once or twice, months ago. That hesitation didn't go unnoticed. While Megan talked, the officers in the observation room compared notes from the crime scene. Blood spatter had not matched her story. The location of Ryan's body and the absence of a trail suggested he had been attacked somewhere else and moved, or at least repositioned after he died. Her story about waking up and finding him collapsed in the kitchen didn't match the time of death estimated by the coroner, which placed it somewhere between midnight and 2 a.m. And then there was her demeanor. Something in it made every officer uncomfortable. She was not numb. She was not distraught. She was playing a part, one she had rehearsed. She laughed again, this time when recalling Ryan's last text message to her, "Good night. I love you." She shook her head and muttered, "If only he knew." That line sent a chill through the room. It wasn't grief, it was something colder, something darker. Back at the apartment, investigators worked carefully and methodically, moving through each room to reconstruct the events of the night before. On first impression, the scene looked almost too perfect, neat, quiet, and unnaturally still. Nothing appeared overturned, no shattered furniture, no visible signs of a struggle. But the blood pool beneath Ryan's body told a different story. His wounds were deep, violent, and deliberate. There had to be more, and there was. In the kitchen, forensics discovered something strange. While the floor around Ryan's body was soaked with blood, the countertop and surrounding area were clean, spotless. In fact, no handprints, no spatter on the cupboards, no blood dripping anywhere but in one concentrated spot. The knife, the presumed weapon, was lying neatly beside his hand, almost placed rather than dropped. The blade was wiped on one side, and yet, Megan had said she found him like that and tried to help him. If she had moved the knife or attempted CPR as she claimed, the position of the weapon and the blood smear patterns didn't make sense. Her story was already starting to fall apart. Then came a bigger discovery. In the bedroom, small smears of blood were found on the bedsheet near the foot of the bed. It wasn't enough to suggest he had been attacked there, but enough to raise questions. Was there a scuffle in the bedroom that continued to the kitchen? Did Ryan try to escape? Investigators followed the trail. In the hallway, they found a faint footprint, barefoot, bloody, partially cleaned. Someone had stepped in the blood and tried to wipe it away. That someone, it seemed, had also tried to control the scene. The bathroom raised more questions. Inside the sink, fragments of a broken wine glass were found, shards with no explanation. The trash can contained blood-streaked tissues and a pair of yellow rubber gloves. Megan had never mentioned any cleanup. In fact, she had said she had frozen in shock when she found Ryan. The gloves told a different story. The biggest surprise came in the living room, where Ryan had set up a small home studio for his photography. Hidden behind one of his mounted lights was a motion-activated camera. Investigators discovered it during their second sweep of the apartment, realizing it had likely been used for recording time-lapse shots of the city skyline through the window. What they didn't expect was that the camera had been rolling during the night of the murder. They secured the memory card and sent it to the lab for analysis. While the camera was angled toward the living room, the hope was that it had captured audio of what happened. Maybe even visual evidence if the fight had spilled into the area. Megan hadn't known it was on, and that alone gave investigators an edge. Every room in the apartment whispered pieces of the truth. There were no signs of forced entry, no fingerprints that didn't belong, no suggestion of a suicide. Everything, from the hidden blood smears to the perfectly placed knife, pointed to one conclusion: Ryan hadn't died by his own hand. He had been silenced, carefully, cruelly, and deliberately. The footage from Ryan's camera turned out to be the key that started to unravel everything Megan had carefully tried to conceal. It wasn't a high-end surveillance setup, just a motion-activated DSLR mounted on a tripod in the corner of the living room, pointed toward the large windows. Its original purpose had been to capture long-exposure shots of city lights and nighttime skies, but that night, the camera had caught something far more important than traffic trails and twinkling buildings. It had recorded the horrors leading up to Ryan's death, minute by minute. Investigators watched the footage closely. At first, it showed nothing unusual, just a dimly lit living room, still and quiet. Around 11:40 p.m., movement triggered the recording. Megan entered the frame, pacing slowly, her arms crossed tightly. She seemed agitated, tense. Ryan appeared seconds later, walking in from the hallway, shirtless and clearly tired. The two of them stood just out of clear view, their voices low and muffled. But as the minutes passed, the tension escalated. Though their faces were sometimes just out of frame, their body language and tones grew increasingly hostile. The audio wasn't crystal clear, but investigators enhanced it enough to make out the rhythm and tone of the conversation. Megan was accusing Ryan of something: cheating, lying, hiding things. Ryan's voice was calmer, trying to diffuse the argument. He kept repeating phrases like, "You're overthinking," and "let's talk tomorrow." But Megan was relentless. Her voice rose. There was a loud bang. Possibly a glass slammed on the table, and Ryan shouted, then silence. What followed next sent a chill through everyone watching. At around midnight, the camera recorded a crash, then footsteps moving quickly. Ryan's voice was heard again, strained, panicked, pleading for Megan to stop. Then came a scream. A long, blood-curdling scream. Not Megan's, but Ryan's. The sound of a struggle erupted off camera. Something heavy fell, then nothing. The camera kept recording for several more minutes, but no one re-entered the frame. No calls were made. No lights turned on. Just silence, broken only by faint sounds, movement, maybe breathing, maybe someone standing very still just out of sight. At 12:19 a.m., Megan reappeared in the frame briefly. She wasn't crying. She wasn't shaking. She walked calmly to the kitchen, her posture stiff, her expression unreadable in the dim light. She glanced toward the camera but didn't seem to realize it was on. Then she disappeared from view again. That footage, while it didn't capture the actual stabbing, completely shattered Megan's version of events. Ryan was alive and coherent minutes before midnight. There was no mention of self-harm, no sign of despair. He had sounded scared, not suicidal. The calmness Megan displayed afterward, the lack of any attempt to call for help, painted a much darker picture. With this recording, detectives had their first major breakthrough. It wasn't just that Megan's story didn't match the evidence, it was that she had been actively trying to control the narrative. But now, they had a version of the night that she couldn't edit, delete, or explain away. When detectives confronted Megan with the footage from Ryan's camera, her reaction was immediate, but not the one they expected. The smirk she had worn throughout her interviews faded just slightly, and her eyes narrowed as if trying to gauge how much they knew. She didn't ask to see the video. She didn't deny it was real. Instead, she leaned back in her chair and simply said, "You don't see what happened off camera." It was a vague, slippery statement, designed to plant doubt without offering explanation. But the confidence that had once filled her voice was beginning to crack. She shifted her story. Now Megan claimed Ryan had become violent during their argument. She said he grabbed her, shoved her against the wall, and threatened her. She described a frantic struggle, insisting she had no choice but to defend herself. The stabbing, she said, was an accident. She was scared, cornered, reacting in the moment. She didn't remember how many times she stabbed him. Everything was a blur, but the facts didn't support her new version of events. Forensics had already confirmed Ryan had been drugged before his death. A powerful sedative was found in his system, enough to impair his motor skills and prevent him from fighting back. The source of that drug, a crushed-up pill bottle found in Megan's bathroom cabinet, the same prescription she had quietly filled 2 weeks earlier without telling anyone. It wasn't medication she was known to take. Detectives also noticed how carefully Megan had tried to manage the aftermath. The cleanup efforts in the bathroom, the attempt to reposition the knife, the way she had staged her discovery of the body, all signs of premeditation, not panic. This wasn't someone who had acted out of fear. This was someone who had planned, executed, and then tried to manipulate the story afterward. Even more revealing was what they found when they analyzed Megan's online activity. Just hours before Ryan's death, she had searched phrases like, "How much Ambien is too much," and "stab wound survival rates." A week earlier, she had been reading articles about criminal interrogation techniques, specifically focusing on how body language is interpreted. She had also bookmarked a forum post about famous murder cases, where the killer pretended to be a grieving partner. Each new piece of evidence chipped away at Megan's story, and yet, during each interview, she held tightly to her calm, detached demeanor. But the cracks were beginning to show. She no longer smiled. She asked for breaks more frequently. Her voice grew flatter, her answers more rehearsed. Gone was the woman who had once loused during questioning, who thought she could charm her way out of suspicion. Megan had underestimated how much the truth could speak for itself. With every test result, every digital footprint, and every forensic report, her control over the story weakened. She wasn't the grieving girlfriend anymore. She was becoming the prime suspect in a case that was no longer just about lies. It was about deliberate, calculated murder. Just when investigators thought they had uncovered all they could, a deeper digital search revealed something even more chilling. an unsent email sitting quietly in Megan's drafts folder. It was discovered during a routine forensic scan of her laptop, a task done more out of thoroughness than expectation. The subject line was simple: if they ask. The body of the email, however, read like a script for deception. It wasn't addressed to anyone. It was a private guide, clearly written for herself, outlining in shocking detail what to say if questioned about Ryan's death. The email included phrases like, "Make eye contact often, don't cry too early, and stick to the 'I found him' story." There were notes reminding herself to act confused about the timeline, to casually mention Ryan's supposed depression, and to appear shocked, not hysterical. The final line was the most disturbing: "Smile when it makes them uncomfortable. That keeps them off balance." Alongside the email was a folder titled Inspiration. Inside were articles, videos, and crime documentaries about women who had killed their partners and initially fooled authorities. Some were famous cases, others more obscure. Megan had highlighted parts of those articles and saved them as PDFs, noting what had worked for each killer, how they had spoken, what mistakes they had made, how the public had reacted to their appearances in court. She had even saved a photo of one woman's courtroom outfit, with a comment beneath it that read, "Soft colors, innocence." This wasn't someone who had snapped in a moment of fear. This was someone who had prepared. Megan had built a story before the crime even happened, crafting a version of events she could perform. The pieces she had put in place, the drugging, the wiping of fingerprints, the staged crying, all made sense now. She hadn't panicked after Ryan's death. She had executed a plan she had written in her own words. The detectives, now armed with both digital and physical evidence, felt they finally understood the full picture. Ryan hadn't been a threat to Megan. He had been preparing to leave her. He had started packing some of his things, according to his friend, and had even looked at new apartments online. Megan had found out, and in her mind, losing Ryan wasn't an option. If she couldn't have him, no one could. They printed out the email and placed it in a file that would be handed to the prosecution. Combined with the hidden camera footage, the forensics, the toxicology report, and now her own words, they had built a case that would be impossible to tear down. When Megan was shown the draft, she didn't speak. She didn't ask how they had found it. She didn't deny it was hers. For the first time since the investigation began, she had no explanation, no deflection, no smirk, just silence. A silence that told the detectives what they already knew. Megan had written her own confession, not with a signature but with strategy, and the belief that she would get away with murder. Megan's arrest was swift. Officers arrived at her apartment just before dawn, not wanting to give her time to react or run. She opened the door wearing the same expression she had worn for weeks, controlled, unreadable, almost bored. When they informed her of the charges, first-degree murder, she raised her eyebrows slightly, but said nothing. As she was handcuffed and escorted to the patrol car, neighbors peeked through blinds and cracked doors, shocked to see the woman they once described as charming being taken away for killing the man she claimed to love. The trial began 6 months later. By then, the case had gained significant attention. News outlets covered it as a twisted story of obsession, manipulation, and murder. The headlines dubbed Megan the smiling girlfriend, a reference to her behavior during initial police interviews. In court, she dressed in soft pastels, as if trying to rebrand herself. Her hair was neatly tied back, and she carried a notebook, scribbling occasionally as if she were a passive observer rather than the accused. But the prosecution came prepared. They started with the facts, the blood evidence, the sedative found in Ryan's system, the staged crime scene. Then they played the audio from the hidden camera. The courtroom fell silent as Ryan's voice echoed through the speakers, calm at first, then fearful, then pleading. The audio ended with a haunting silence that seemed to stretch forever. Jurors looked down. Some looked away. Megan stared ahead, her face pale, her hands gripping the arms of her chair tightly. The prosecution continued with the digital trail, Megan's search history, the broken glass in the sink, the email titled, "If They Ask." They read her words aloud. the instructions she had written for herself, the strategies, the reminders to cry at the right moments, the way she had practiced deceit like a performance. The jurors didn't just hear the evidence, they felt it. It wasn't just a crime, it was a story Megan had tried to control from start to finish. When the defense took their turn, they leaned heavily on Megan's claims of emotional distress. They painted Ryan as unpredictable, claimed Megan feared for her safety, but they had no evidence to support it. There were no records of abuse, no witnesses to angry outbursts from Ryan, no texts or calls where Megan had ever expressed fear. All they had was Megan's word, and by now that word was worthless. The jury deliberated for only 4 hours. When they returned with a verdict of guilty on all counts, Megan didn't cry. She didn't speak. She didn't even look surprised. It was as if, after all her planning and pretending, she finally understood the one thing she hadn't accounted for. The truth has a way of surfacing. She was sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole. Her final moments in court were quiet, her hands folded in her lap, her expression empty. The girl who had once smiled during interrogations now sat motionless, finally faced with a reality she couldn't rehearse, revise, or control.